One important distinction to make whenever you jump into creating your own context is considering the difference between a context that you jump into because you're reacting to your circumstances and the environment that you're in versus an environment or a tool that you proactively engage in with. And whenever you think about the work that you're doing, the projects that you put out there, and the context that you assign to the tasks that are a part of those projects, you need to think about the specific instance and the scenario that you're going to be engaging with that specific work. Now, when we think about contexts, the stereotypical way of thinking about those is in a reactive mindset. So if we look at the reactive style context that we have here, you typically think about, well, my MacBook Pro. I go and I work on my MacBook Pro. When I happen to be on my MacBook Pro doing something, I'm going to pull up this list and I'm going to work on it. And as I'm on that tool, I'm going to continue working from that specific project or that specific context. In the same way that people typically think about energy levels, you could do the same thing. Whenever I find that I have a lot of energy, I have some time available, when I realize that I'm in that scenario, I can pull up my Big Rocks context and start to work on it. Same thing with after hours. After I get off work, whenever I realize I'm in that scenario, I can step into that context and start to work on those items on that list. Now, think about how you react and whenever you do that, and then you think about going to the proactive side of things. So if we look at these proactive items, you will see things like admin, OmniFocus, sharpen the saw. These are scenarios and instances that you have to actively put yourself into in order to pull up that list. So I set aside time. I'm going to jump into my daily review. That means it's time for me to pull up my admin or my meta context and start to work from that. It's the time that I'm going to set aside to sharpen everything that's going on and keep the system working. But it's a time that I've set aside and I proactively go into that context. Now, the challenge that I have here is primarily with these reactive contexts. And the reason I have a challenge with that is because for me, and I would challenge most of us to think about this, is that I never just magically happen to be at my MacBook Pro. I have actively made a decision to go work on that tool. It's one that I have chosen to go work on. I have something I need to do on it because it's time sensitive, or the project that I want or I choose to work on today is indicative that that's the particular tool that I'm going to use. So that means that no, it's not a reactive context. It's actually proactive. I just think about it as reactive because I pull up the list once I'm on it. But at some point, I had to make the decision to go work on it. So it's not actually a reactive context, but rather it's a proactive. So if we move it down to the proactive side, that's, to me, where that should belong. Now, look at Big Rocks. Again, this is something that it requires full focus. I have to have a decent amount of time. But the more that you study willpower and the more that you study your ability to focus, what you'll find is that there are actually ways that you can put yourself in that scenario. If you choose to create the willpower and the strength and the focus and the concentration to do a big rock task, you can also set aside the time for it. You can always cancel a meeting. You can always choose not to go to one. There might be ramifications to that, but ultimately you're proactively putting yourself into a situation that you can do that. You're setting aside time for it. You're putting yourself in the mindset in order to work on that. Yes, there's potentially scenarios where you're reacting to the energy levels that you have in order to choose to work on those, but for the most part, you're proactively making a decision to do that. Now, this specific one is a little more nuanced and it's a little more difficult to get your head around, but to me, I know that those are instances where I would proactively go into that scenario. So again, I would move that down to the proactive side. And the last one I have here is after hours. Well, this one to me is pretty cut and dry. You choose to leave work. You've made the choice to be done with work, whether it's long after the time that you wanted to or long before. Regardless, evenings, weekends, you're choosing not to work at that time. You can always go do something. If you're in the technology world and the knowledge work world, you know that it's very easy to always find time to continue to work. So you're choosing to move into that. So once again, this is a proactive context. And I have looked at a lot of lists of contexts over time, and the more time I've spent looking at them and the more you consider them, the more you realize that every single context is one that you are proactively putting yourself into. So we typically think of them as something that you react to, but if you consider them from the standpoint of, no, you're actually proactively going into those contexts, that means that your context list is not a list of things that you just magically jump into, but rather you have to choose to put yourself into them. And the reason I bring this all up, the reason this is important, is because whenever you develop your list of contexts, whenever you choose which context you're going to operate with, it's important to think of them as scenarios that you're going to put yourself into in order to do that task. It's not something that you're going to react to, but rather you're going to make a choice to do. And when you think about the tools that you're going to choose to work on a task, then, or even the locations of the scenarios, whatever process it is you want to do in order to put those together, when you think about them as a proactive context, you go from choosing context and indicating which context for a task based on the scenario you would be in order to work on them to the scenario that you should be in order to work on them. So whenever I choose a context for a task, for me, I choose the context that is best suited for that task. It's not a choice about where I should be or what I could have, but what I should have, if you get the difference there. So to me, it's important to choose a context for a task that is most effectively suited for that task. So when you think about them from a proactive standpoint, you start to choose context differently than you would if you think about them from a reactive standpoint. So when you choose your context, just make sure that you're reconsidering how you want to assign context to your tasks in the long run.